Now, the purpose of the Bible is to testify of Jesus Christ. The Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, points to Christ.
The Bible is true in a very strange way. What you do as an educated person is sample that structure that constitutes the sum total of the texts of our civilization.
Because if those four things are true, that there's truth, that God exists, that miracles are possible, and the New Testament is reliable enough to let us know that the resurrection occurred, then Christianity is true. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity is true.
So, what is the food you give to the soul? It is reading the Bible, the Word of God. And I don't care who you are, you cannot live a victorious life if you neglect Bible reading and Bible study.
But what we have at stake here is far more than that. You know, your life depends on this book. So read it.
Matthew Henry Complete Commentary Exodus chapter 16. This chapter gives us an account of the victualling of the camp of Israel. First, their complaint for want of bread, verses 1 through 3. Second, the notice God gave them beforehand of the provision He intended to make for them, verses 4 through 12. Third, the sending of the manna, verses 13 through 15. Fourth, the laws and orders concerning the manna. 1. That they should gather it daily for their daily bread, verses 16 through 21. 2. That they should gather a double portion on the sixth day, verses 22 through 26. 3. That they should expect none on the seventh day, verses 27 through 31. 4. That they should preserve a pot of it for a memorial, verses 32, etc. Verses 1 through 12. The host of Israel, it seems, took along with them out of Egypt. When they came thence on the 15th day of the first month, a month's provisions, which by the 15th day of the second month was all spent. And here we have, first, their discontent and murmuring upon that occasion, verses 2 and 3. The whole congregation, the greatest part of them, joined in this mutiny. It was not immediately against God that they murmured, but which was equivalent against Moses and Aaron, God's vicegerents among them. 1. They count upon being killed in the wilderness, nothing less, at the first appearance of disaster. If the Lord had been pleased to kill them, He could easily have done that in the Red Sea. But then He preserved them, and now could as easily provide for them. It argues great distrust of God, and of His power and goodness in every distress, an appearance of danger to despair of life, and to talk of nothing but being speedily killed. 2. They invidiously charge Moses with a design to starve them when he brought them out of Egypt, whereas what he had done was both by order from God and with a design to promote their welfare. Note, it is no new thing for the greatest kindnesses to be misinterpreted and basely represented as the greatest injuries. The worst colors are sometimes put upon the best actions. Nay, 3. They so far undervalue their deliverance that they wish they had died in Egypt, nay, and died by the hand of the Lord too, that is, by some of the plagues which cut off the Egyptians, as if it were not the hand of the Lord, but of Moses only, that brought them into this hungry wilderness. It is common for people to say of that pain, or sickness, or sore, of which they see not the second causes, it is what pleases God, as if that were not so likewise which comes by the hand of man, or some visible accident. Prodigious madness. They would rather die by the flesh pots of Egypt, where they found themselves with provision, than live under the guidance of the heavenly pillar in a wilderness, and be provided for by the hand of God. They pronounce it better to have fallen in the destruction of God's enemies than to bear the fatherly discipline of His children. We cannot suppose that they had any great plenty in Egypt, how largely soever they now talk of the flesh pots, nor could they fear dying for want in the wilderness, while they had their flocks and herds with them. But discontent magnifies what is past, and vilifies what is present, without regard to truth or reason. None talk more absurdly than murmurers. Their impatience, ingratitude, and distrust of God were so much the worse in that they had lately received such miraculous favors and convincing proofs both that God could help them in the greatest exigencies, and that really He had mercy in store for them. See how soon they forgot His works, and provoked Him at the sea, even at the Red Sea. Psalms chapter 106 verses 7 through 13. Note, experiences of God's mercies greatly aggravate our distrusts and murmurings. Second, the care God graciously took for their supply. Justly He might have said, I will rain fire and brimstone upon these murmurers, and consume them, but, quite contrary, He promises to rain bread upon them. Observe, 1. How God makes known to Moses His kind intentions, that he might not be uneasy at their murmurings, nor be tempted to wish He had let them alone in Egypt. 1. He takes notice of the people's complaints. I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel, verse 12. As a God of pity, He took cognizance of their necessity, which was the occasion of their murmuring. As a just and holy God, He took cognizance of their base and unworthy reflections upon His servant Moses, and was much displeased with them. Note, when we begin to fret and be uneasy, we ought to consider that God hears all our murmurings, though silent, and only the murmurings of the heart. Princes, parents, masters, do not hear all the murmurs of their inferiors against them. And it is well they do not, for perhaps they could not bear it, but God hears, and yet bears. We must not think, because God does not immediately take vengeance on men for their sins, that therefore He does not take notice of them. No, He hears the murmurings of Israel, and is grieved with this generation, and yet continues His care of them, as the tender parent of the froward child. 2. He promises them a speedy, sufficient, and constant supply. Verse 4. Man being made out of the earth, his Maker has wisely ordered him food out of the earth. Psalms 104 verse 14. But the people of Israel, typifying the church of the firstborn that are written in heaven, and born from above, and being themselves immediately under the direction and government of heaven, receiving their charters, laws, and commissions from heaven also receive their food, their law being given by the disposition of angels. They did also eat angels' food. See what God designed in making this provision for them, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my law or no. 1. Thus He tried whether they would trust Him, and walk in the law of faith, or no, whether they could live from hand to mouth. And though now uneasy because their provisions were spent, could rest satisfied with the bread of the day in its day, and depend upon God for fresh supplies tomorrow. 2. Thus He tried whether they would serve Him, and be always faithful to so good a master, that provided so well for His servants. And hereby He made it appear to all the world, in the issue, what an ungrateful people they were, whom nothing could affect with a sense of obligation. Let favor be shown to them, yet will they not learn righteousness. Isaiah chapter 26 verse 10. 2. How Moses made known these intentions to Israel, as God ordered him. Here Aaron was his prophet, as he had been to Pharaoh. Moses directed Aaron what to speak to the congregation of Israel. Verse 9. And some think that, while Aaron was giving a public summons to the congregation to come near before the Lord, Moses retired to pray, and that the appearance of the glory of the Lord, verse 10, was an answer to his prayer. They are called to come near, as Isaiah chapter 1 verse 18, Come, and let us reason together. Note, God condescends to give even murmurs a fair hearing. And shall we then despise the cause of our inferiors when they contend with us? Job chapter 31 verse 13. First, he convinces them of the evil of their murmurings. They thought they reflected only upon Moses and Aaron, but here they are told that God was struck it through their sides. This is much insisted on verses 7 and 8. Your murmurings are not against us, then we would have been silent. But against the Lord it was he that led you into these straits, and not we. Note, when we murmur against those who are instruments of any uneasiness to us, whether justly or unjustly, we should do well to consider how much we reflect upon God by it men are but God's hand, those that quarrel with the reproofs and convictions of the word, and are angry with their ministers, when they are touched in a tender part, know not what they do. For therein they strive with their Maker. Let this forever stop the mouth of murmuring, that it is daring impiety to murmur at God. Because he is God, and gross absurdity to murmur at men, because they are but men. 2. He assures them of the supply of their wants, that since they had harped upon the flesh pots, so much they should for once have flesh in abundance that evening, and bread the next morning. And so on every day thenceforward. Verses 8 and 12. Many there are of whom we say that they are better fed than taught. But the Israelites were thus fed, that they might be taught. He led him about, he instructed him. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 10. And, as to this instance, see Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 3, he fed thee with manna, that thou mightest know that man doth not live by bread only. And, besides this, here are two things mentioned, which he intended to teach them by sending the manna. 1. By this you shall know that the Lord hath brought you out from the land of Egypt. Verse 6. That they were brought out of Egypt was plain enough, but so strangely sottish and short-sighted were they that they said it was Moses that brought them out. Verse 3. Now God sent the manna, to prove that it was no less than infinite power and goodness that brought them out, and this could perfect what was begun. If Moses only had brought them out of Egypt, he could not thus have fed them. They must therefore own that that was the Lord's doing. Because this was so, and both were marvelous in their eyes, yet, long afterwards, they needed to be told that Moses gave them not this bread from heaven. John chapter 6 verse 32. 2. By this you shall know that I am the Lord your God. Verse 12. This gave proof of his power as the Lord, and his particular favor to them as their God. When God plagued the Egyptians, it was to make them know that he was the Lord when he provided for the Israelites. It was to make them know that he was their God. 3. How God himself manifested his glory, to still the murmurings of the people, and to put a reputation upon Moses and Aaron. Verse 10. While Aaron was speaking, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The cloud itself, one would think, was enough both to strike an awe upon them, and to give encouragement to them, yet, in a few days, it had grown so familiar to them that it made no impression upon them, unless it shone with an unusual brightness. Note, what God's ministers say to us is then likely to do us good when the glory of God shines in with it upon our souls. Verses 13 through 21. Now, they begin to be provided for by the immediate hand of God. First, he makes them a feast at night of delicate fowl. Feathered fowl. Psalms chapter 78 verse 27. Therefore not locusts, as some think quails, or pheasants, or some wild fowl came up, and covered the camp, so tame that they might take up as many of them as they pleased. Note, God gives us of the good things of this life, not only for necessity, but for delight, that we may not only serve him, but serve him cheerfully. Second, next morning he rained manna upon them, which was to be continued to them for their daily bread. 1. That which was provided for them was manna, which descended from the clouds, so that, in some sense, they might be said to live upon the air. It came down in dew that melted, and yet was itself of such a consistency as to serve for nourishing, strengthening food, without anything else. They called it manna, manhu. What is this? Either, what a poor thing this is, despising it, or, what a strange thing this is, admiring it, or it is a portion, no matter what it is that which our God has allotted us. And we will take it, and be thankful. Verses 14 and 15. It was pleasant food. The Jews say that it was palatable to all, however varied their tastes. It was wholesome food, light of digestion, and very necessary. Dr. Grew says to cleanse them from disorders with which he thinks it probable that they were, in the time of their bondage, more or less infected, which disorders a luxurious diet would have made contagious. By this spare and plain diet we are all taught a lesson of temperance, and forbidden to desire dainties and varieties. 2. They were to gather it every morning. Verse 21. The portion of a day in his day. Verse 4. Thus they must live upon daily providence, as the fowls of the air, of which it is said, that which thou givest them, they gather. Psalms chapter 104 verse 28. Not today for tomorrow. Let the morrow take thought for the things of itself. To this daily raining and gathering of manna our Savior seems to allude when he teaches us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. We are hereby taught 1. Prudence and diligence in providing food convenient for ourselves and our household. What God graciously gives we must industriously gather with quietness, working and eating our own bread, not the bread either of idleness or deceit. God's bounty leaves room for man's duty. It did so even when manna was rained. They must not eat till they have gathered. 2. Contentment and satisfaction with the sufficiency. They must gather. Every man according to his eating. Enough is as good as a feast, and more than enough is as bad as a surfeit. Those that have most have, for themselves, but food and raiment and mirth. And those that have least generally have these, so that he who gathers much has nothing over, and he who gathers little has no lack. There is not so great a disproportion between one and another in the comforts and enjoyments of the things of this life as there is in the property and possession of the things themselves. 3. Dependence upon providence. Let no man leave till morning. Verse 19. But let them learn to go to bed and sleep quietly, though they have not a bit of bread in their tent, nor in all their camp, trusting that God, with the following day, will bring them their daily bread. It was surer and safer in God's storehouse than in their own, and would thence come to them sweeter and fresher. Read with this, Matthew chapter 6 verse 25, take no thought for your life, etc. See here the folly of hoarding the manna that was laid up by some who thought themselves wiser and better managers than their neighbors, and who would provide in case it should fail next day, putrefied and bred worms, and became good for nothing. Note, that proves to be most wasted which is covetously and distrustfully spared. Those riches are corrupted. James chapter 5 verses 2 and 3. Let us set ourselves to think, 1. Of that great power of God which fed Israel in the wilderness, and made miracles their daily bread. What cannot this God do, who prepared a table in the wilderness, and furnished it richly even for those who questioned whether he could or no? Psalms chapter 78 verses 19 and 20. Never was there such a market of provisions as this, where so many 100,000 men were daily furnished, without money and without price. Never was there such an open house kept as God kept in the wilderness for 40 years together, nor such free and plentiful entertainment given. the feast which Ahasuerus made, to show the riches of his kingdom. And the honor of his majesty was nothing to this. Esther chapter 1 verse 4. It is said, verse 21, when the sun waxed hot, it melted as if what was left were drawn up by the heat of the sun into the air to be the seed of the next day's harvest, and so from day to day. 2. Of that constant providence of God which gives food to all flesh. For his mercy endures forever. Psalms chapter 136 verse 25. He is a great housekeeper that provides for all the creatures. The same wisdom, power, and goodness that now brought food daily out of the clouds are employed in the constant course of nature, bringing food yearly out of the earth, and giving us all things richly to enjoy. Verses 22 through 31 we have here 1. A plain intimation of the observing of a seventh-day Sabbath, not only before the giving of the law upon Mount Sinai, but before the bringing of Israel out of Egypt. And therefore, from the beginning, Genesis chapter 2 verse 3. If the Sabbath had now been first instituted, how could Moses have understood what God said to him, verse 5, concerning a double portion to be gathered on the sixth day, without making any express mention of the Sabbath? And how could the people so readily take the hint, verse 22, even to the surprise of the rulers, before Moses had declared that it was done with a regard to the Sabbath, if they had not had some knowledge of the Sabbath before? The setting apart of one day in 7 for holy work, and, in order to that, for holy rest, was a divine appointment ever since God created man upon the earth, and the most ancient of positive laws. The way of Sabbath sanctification is the good old way. 2. The double provision which God made for the Israelites, and which they were to make for themselves. On the sixth day, God gave them on the sixth day the bread of 2 days, verse 29. Appointing them to rest on the seventh day, he took care that they should be no losers by it, and none ever will be losers by serving God. On that day they were to fetch in enough for 2 days, and to prepare it, verse 23. The law was very strict that they must bake and seethe the day before, and not on the Sabbath day. This does not now make it unlawful for us to dress meat on the Lord's day, but directs us to contrive our family affairs so that they may hinder us as little as possible in the work of the Sabbath. Works of necessity, no doubt, are to be done on that day, but it is desirable to have as little as may be to do of things necessary to the life that now is, that we may apply ourselves the more closely to the one thing needful. That which they kept up for their food on the Sabbath day did not putrefy, verse 24. When they kept it in opposition to a command, verse 20, it stank. When they kept it in obedience to a command, it was sweet and good, for everything is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. 3. The intermission of the manna on the seventh day. God did not send it then, and therefore they must not expect it, nor go out to gather. Verses 25 and 26. This showed that it was not produced by natural causes, and that it was designed for a confirmation of the divine authority of the law which was to be given by Moses. Thus God took an effectual course to make them remember the Sabbath day. They could not forget it, nor the day of preparation for it. Some, it seems, went out on the seventh day, expecting to find manna, verse 27. But they found none, for those that will find must seek in the appointed time. Seek the Lord while he may be found. God, upon this occasion, said to Moses, How long refuse you to keep my commandments? Verse 28. Why did he say this to Moses? He was not disobedient. No, but he was the ruler of a disobedient people. And God charges it upon him, that he might the more warmly charge it upon them. and might take care that their disobedience should not be through any neglect or default of his. It was for going out to seek for manna on his seventh day that they were thus reproved. Note, 1. Disobedience, even in a small matter, is very provoking. 2. God is jealous for the honor of his Sabbaths. If walking out on the Sabbath to seek for food was thus reproved, walking out on that day purely to find our own pleasure cannot be justified.